Welcome to Scale Model Workshop. In the last episode about the Airfix Spitfire FR Mark XIV, I demonstrated a straightforward approach to backdating the kit's rear vision canopy to the typical Spitfire hood using just the basic kit itself. And while I'm still finishing that one up, there are elements of the basic kit that I found lacking and inconsistent with my personal vision of what I like to see in an all-up model. So I decided to have a go at an early Spitfire Mark XIVc, the Supermarine way. Both the Air Ministry and Supermarine described the Mark XIV as a useful interim type, and they always considered it a Mark VIII conversion, referring to it as such in the first certificate of design issued in 1943 as Type 369. The certificate simply read,
Griffin 61, 65, or 85. This aeroplane, basically Spitfire F Mark VIII production, is being modified as indicated. Engine mounting Spitfire Mark XXI production type. Fuselage Spitfire F8 production adapted to the F21 type equipment at frame 5. Special longerons and modified tail end. Main plane Spitfire F8 with modified cooling system and fitted with standard wingtips. All up weight, 8,600 pounds.
To follow Supermarine, I started with an Eduard Spitfire 8 and used the Airfix FR Mark XIV for the necessary elements stated in the original certificate of design. The fuselage modifications were based on the excellent drawings by R.J. Khurana, published in Richard Frank's book on the Griffin Spitfire. The plans state 48 scale, but they're printed small, so I had to enlarge them to the final size. Looking at the drawing, you can see that the Griffin engine was mounted slightly declined from the datum line of the airframe. And it's interesting to note that counter to what you might think about lengthening the nose, the configuration of the Griffin engine and its mounting actually afforded pilots a better in-flight visibility compared to the two-stage Merlin types. I started the conversion with the most obvious element, the Griffin engine. Using corresponding panel lines as a guide, I plotted out my cut so as to avoid the panel lines. That way, when I later rescribe the lines, I'll have one homogeneous surface to work with. The cut line was laid out with various widths of 3M fine line tape. The cut line was then scribed in. I used a handpiece with a saw blade to do the gross separation. The rest of the material was removed with a file. The two sections were laid up on the drawing and cemented together with a mixture of acrylic resin powder and Zap-A-Gap. Here's the final join. This is a comparison against the unmodified Mark VIII kit. The basic components of the cockpit were assembled in the finished fuselage half. Since my model's going on the ceiling, I really just need a place to plant the pilot. The opposite fuselage halves were sectioned up following the same pattern. Only the Mark VIII section was glued to place, and I was careful to apply glue just to these areas. The remaining Griffin engine portion was fit to place and joined with the same cyanoacrylate and acrylic resin powder mixture. Moving back to the tail section, the remaining portions of the Mark XIV fuselage were taped together. A piece of 20,000 styrene was inserted to wedge the two halves apart. Cement was carefully applied to only these indicated areas. The styrene was slipped out and the rudder mated up. When set up, the stabilizer and rudder are only attached to one side at these specific areas. I used the same piece of 20,000 styrene to wedge apart the Mark VIII tail and remove the corresponding half of the vertical stabilizer. Here I'm finishing off the cut with a file. The Mark 14 stabilizer was sectioned off and fit to place on the Mark 8 fuselage. The existing Mark 8 stabilizer half served as a perfect guide to exactly align the Mark 14 stabilizer and rudder. As a general tip, when you're fitting parts together like this, you frequently need to remove a little material and continually test fit. One way to maintain a reference for removal of material is to place a piece of tape along the edge. This gives you an idea of how much you're removing. Before cementing the stabilizer, a piece of aluminum foil, or aluminium foil to my friends in the UK, was slipped between the two halves to prevent them from being cemented together. Once the Mark 14 stabilizer was in place, the other half of the Mark 8 stabilizer was then removed. The remaining half of the Mark 14 stabilizer can now be cemented in its place. Here's the Mark 8 fuselage with the completed modifications. The wing was assembled and cemented in place. The front of the Airfix carburetor intake was cut and grafted onto the rear portion of the intake that's molded into the Eduard wing. This took a bit of adjustment, filling, and recontouring. The Mark 14 carburetor intake is shaped differently from the Mark 8, and Airfix does a nice job of replicating the shape. Finally, the Airfix Mark 14 radiators were assembled as per the instructions. To adapt the Mark 14 radiators to Eduard's Mark 8 wing, I found it easier to remove the flanges from each side and then thin the sides down a bit so that the radiator housing drops into the recesses in the Eduard wing. The resulting gap is easily filled with epoxy clay. So following on the Air Ministry's Certificate of Design to Supermarine, that's how I handled the major components in the conversion of the Eduard Spitfire Mark 8 using parts from the Airfix FR Mark 14. If you've been following these conversions, I'll be doing a follow-up on finishing both of them. So long for now, and I'll see you next time.